thank you all for coming. I'm Alejandro Chafuen, Alex Chafuen. I regard myself as a good friend of the Bahamas because we started coming here in the late 80s. And I want to thank Rick Lowe, who's not here with us, and Jorge Borlandelli of the Nassau Institute, and John Thompson, and so many good friends of the Nassau Institute for helping us to have this discussion. Some of you know that some of us are here because we are members of the John Templeton Foundation and the Templeton Religion Trust, which so generously have supported efforts for the free society around the globe. It's a privilege to have here Chris Stewart from the Templeton Religion Trust. And just a little bit of history. Our first workshop in Latin America was done in 1987 in Jamaica, and I think we were smaller than this. We did not intend to have a very big meeting because we could not get a bigger room. Only this one opened a few weeks ago. But that meeting opened the doors for the Atlas Foundation, Atlas Economic Research Foundation, Atlas Network, which is the current name we are using, to develop a huge network of Latin American and Caribbean think tanks. Our network in Latin America approximately has, between 70 and 100 think tanks. Gonzalo Schwartz here directs those programs. And again, I believe that small countries can have tremendous impact around the globe. I just came from Portugal, but from Singapore, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, you can go on and on and on. And the Caribbean, as we all know, has tremendous potential. From the point of view of politics, I think has more clout than from the point of view of economics, because it's almost, 1/3 of the votes of the Organization of American States. While economics, again, I don't have the exact calculation, but I doubt it passes the 5% of the region economies. But the potential is huge, and is going to be shaken up a little bit, with potential changes in Cuba, which is the big economy of the region, despite being enslaved by communism. When we did this first workshop, still communism was a dream. The Orthodox communism was a dream. Now it's displaced by the socialism of the 21st century. That again, it has appealed to, I call them some tribal instincts, and they have mastered the art of achieving support through monetary and political incentives, giving credibility to sectors of the countries that were not recognized before. But again, we all know that Cuba, together with Venezuela, have been very active players in the region, and the new policy announced by the United States might have create changes and incentives for all the countries in the region to change. I think the first speaker of today, I'm really honored to have him here because he couldn't be better, because Otto Reich is Cuban-born. He was ambassador of the United States in Venezuela. He played an illustrious role as Deputy Director of the State Department for Latin America. He has won prestigious award, the Walter Judd Award, for his work, International Work for Freedom. Ronald Reagan, I think, was the first winner of that award. And he is characterized by always speaking his mind. He gets into problems because even when he was in government, he always spoke his mind. I met him, we were reminiscing, I met him first during the Clinton times. There was a commission to study the transition in Cuba. And at the time, the Democrat Party wanted to show that Cuba was changing because they were allowing some hotels and some economic activity. And there was a commission headed by Jeb Bush and Jeane Kirkpatrick. And again, one of the most outspoken members of that commission was Otto Reich. He will be here with us until lunch. I think he might leave a little bit early during lunch, but I know 15 minutes is not long enough to get all the wisdom from this really great member of the United States civil society and lover of freedom in the Americas. Ambassador Otto Reich, thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be here, especially speaking to Atlas and to people associated with the Templeton Foundation, and to be in the Bahamas. Actually, the second time this month. My wife and I spent a wonderful long weekend in one of the outer islands a couple of weeks ago. Since I do have 15 minutes, let me try to be brief. As you know, this being a member of the British Commonwealth, Winston Churchill said, when you speak, either be brief or be brilliant. So I have to be brief. The Cuba policy that President Obama announced on December 17, call it normalization of relations, has received a lot of attention, in my view, very misplaced. There's a lot of people who think that this is really going to open up Cuba to the world, as Pope John Paul II said when he visited nearly 20 years ago, that Cuba should open up to the world should open up to Cuba. What is happening, frankly, is that the world is opening up to Cuba, but nothing is really changing irreversibly inside the island. This has an impact, will have an impact, by the way, on the Bahamas and on the Caribbean, as I will mention briefly in a second, because you will find yourselves competing with an economy run by the Cuban military, a totalitarian society where workers are not employed by the employer, by the company, let's say a hotel developer who comes in, or a hotel manager that comes in and wants to hire cooks or bottle washers or maitre d's or whatever it may be. That employer has to go to a government ministry that then assigns a worker to that hotel, a loyal worker, usually a member of the Communist Party, who is a member of the Communist Party because that's the way he can get a good job, not because he particularly believes anymore in Marxism-Leninism. Especially no one who's lived under Marxism-Leninism believes in it, unless you're a member, of course, of the elite, as the Castro family is. And the Castro family, in fact, owns those hotels. How do they do that? Through a corporation called GAESA, which is the Spanish acronym for actually Grupo de Administración de Empresas S.A., which means Group for the Management of Enterprises. Sounds very innocuous, of course. And it is run by Raúl Castro's son-in-law, a general called López Callejas. The entire tourism industry is owned by the Cuban military. This is the law. And they assign workers, which is bad enough, but when the worker receives his salary, let me step back 1 second. When the employer, let's say Atlantis, whoever owns this hotel, or any other hotel operator, goes to Cuba, and they find a hotel or want to see a hotel built by the military, and they want to manage it, and they want to hire, again, a worker. They negotiate the salary of the worker with the government ministry, who probably say, okay, that will cost you 400 euros. Usually they're European, or in most cases Canadian companies that run these hotels, manage the hotels. They say 400 euros. The company pays 400 euros to the ministry in hard currency. The ministry then turns around and pays 400 pesos to the Cuban worker, which is about 8 cents on the dollar. So this has been called virtual slavery. That is a system that, unfortunately, President Obama, in his desire to achieve the first foreign policy success which he won't, by the way, but in desire to achieve one foreign policy success so far in his 7th year, having had not a single foreign policy success. And if anybody can name one, I'm happy to answer or challenge it. And I'll list, if we have the time, perhaps there are questions and answers, some of the foreign policy failures of this administration, to which I add Cuba. But in his desire to achieve or assure his legacy, he opened up these negotiations in secret, of course, because they could not have stood the light of day. So for 18 months, he negotiated in secret, even keeping the negotiations secret from his own State Department. They did not find out until the 17th month of the 18-month negotiations. Now, of course, they pretend to be very enthusiastic about it, but I believe that they are trying to slow things down a little bit because they realize that just as the negotiations with Iran or any other negotiations undertaken by this president, they are not good for the United States. The State Department people know that. In the case of Cuba, why are they not good for the United States? Mainly because the way that this president has gone about negotiating with Cuba will result in a Russia-style transition, if there is a transition, a Russian-style transition from the military dictatorship, and it is military, it is run by an active duty general. Raúl Castro is a general, and he's referred to as General de Ejército, Raúl Castro, before he's referred to as president in the Cuban press. So it is a military dictatorship with absolutely no freedoms whatsoever. Now, again, think about how the Bahamas or Jamaica or any of the other Caribbean islands are going to compete for tourists with a government that can raise or lower labor costs or any other costs of inputs in not only tourism but any other industry on the island, because they have complete control. That's the definition of a totalitarian society. They have total control over not only the political and the social, but the economic mechanisms on the island. So unfortunately, what the president has done is, rather than negotiate, as, for example, Ronald Reagan did. I worked for President Reagan for 8 years. And again, if we have time, I'd be happy to tell you the differences between Reagan and Obama, which could not be farther apart. I would say about 180 degrees, in terms of making sure that basic American interests are protected. The most important of which, of course, is security, but after that, it's freedom. Freedom for the people of the United States and the people with which the United States is associated. What President Obama has done, in my view, unfortunately, is to identify the United States with the oppressors in Cuba, with the current government in Cuba, rather than with the people, with which it had been identified for the last 55 years. Now, you might say, well, but your policy, the policy of the last 55 years, didn't work. That's one of the first reasons the president gave when he announced this change. Well, I will challenge that. I would say that actually the policy did work. It was established, as you know, to punish the government of Cuba for seizing private property belonging in that time to American citizens without compensation. A government has a right to seize property. Most governments have rights of eminent domain or other rights that they're allowed to seize property. But international law requires just and prompt compensation, for which there was none in the case of Cuba. So that was the beginning of the sanctions. A lot of people say, well, the policy didn't work because it didn't bring democracy to Cuba. Well, unfortunately, that was not the reason why it was established. As the decades went on and the government of Cuba adopted even more aggressive policies toward the United States and democratic governments in the region, the United States added reasons for the maintenance of the economic sanctions on Cuba, which, by the way, is not a blockade. A blockade is an act of war where one country literally blocks the ports of another nation and does not allow commerce to go in and out of the nation's ports. This is a unilateral embargo imposed by the United States, or had been, because we did not want to contribute to our hard currency to a government that was undermining democracy in the hemisphere. And there's not a single country in this hemisphere that has not been attacked by Cuba in one way or another, including, by the way, the Bahamas. You remember in 1980, a Cuban fighter sank a Bahamian patrol boat in the waters between the U.S. and the Bahamas, simply because it could. And that's another characteristic of undemocratic governments. They do things because they can. I mean, Castro has the honor of having had the highest number of political prisoners ever on a per capita basis in the early 60s in Cuba, because he could. And it is that kind of regime that I believe is the unfortunate result, that the unfortunate result of the president's policy will be to perpetuate, unless the policy is changed. We can get into that as well. And I will tell you what the Congress of the United States is doing to prevent this policy from succeeding in its negative outcomes. So unless it is changed, it will result in the perpetuation of the Castro family control of Cuba. Because a lot of people say, well, you know, the Castro brothers are going to die. Well, they may not know about Alejandro Castro Espín, who is Raúl Castro's son, who is a rising colonel in the Interior Ministry, which, if you know anything about totalitarian regimes, you know it's the National Police Department that basically runs the country. So Raúl Castro has his son in in line to be the top cop in Cuba, and his son-in-law, who's already in charge of all the major economic assets. Not bad. I mean, this is something that I think any mafia leader would envy. To not only have his economic family in charge of an entire country, but his own personal family in control, and completely loyal, of course, to the capo, the top leader of the organized crime entity. And that's what I've described countries like Cuba, and by the way, not just Cuba. I mean, I think Russia today is basically an organized crime entity. It is run by a person whose personal wealth has been estimated at about $20 billion, Vladimir Putin, and who runs Russia basically in the same way that he would have if he had been a czar. Ideology aside, the purpose of the motivating factor, I think, of a lot of these people is power and wealth, and it's transparent. You see it again with Putin, who will do anything he wants to do, and why does he? Because he can. Because unfortunately, he has found an adversary in President Obama who believes that he is so persuasive that all he has to do is sit down and talk to anyone, and that anyone will recognize the wisdom and the goodwill of Barack Obama and will put down his aggressiveness. Well, it didn't work too well in Crimea. It didn't work too well in eastern Ukraine. It hasn't worked too well in Syria, Libya, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could name, and I will be happy to name the countries in the last 6.5 years in which the United States or its allies have lost. Hopefully not permanently, because there's always hope. So back to Cuba. Just very briefly, just to sort of set the stage for Q's and A's. So normalizing relations. By the way, interestingly, the president announced on December 17 that he was normalizing relations with Cuba. The State Department no longer uses, and the White House, they no longer use the term normalizing relations. And I asked a high-ranking official of the administration, why is that? They said, well, we realized that it's impossible to normalize relations with that government. It's not a normal government. So we're now calling it resumption of diplomatic relations, which is technically, of course, correct. But even the administration has had to roll back its optimism about what the policy is going to bring about. It's no longer normalization. But whatever it is, this resumption of diplomatic relations will result, unfortunately, in, as I said, in the continuation of this particular economic and political system in Cuba. Because one of the things that this rapprochement has done, it has completely set aside, moved aside, shoved aside the democratic dissident movement that was growing in Cuba. And you see it in things, and I'm getting the notes that I have to start to wind down. But you see it in, for example, the visits of top diplomats or businessmen, politicians, or even heads of state, like the president of France. Went to Cuba, first time the president of France had gone to Cuba, did not meet with a single dissident. I mean, I think it's a disgrace for the president of a great democracy like France to go to Cuba and pay homage to a terrorist, because Fidel Castro is and has been a terrorist, and again, I can document it if anybody's interested, and not visit a single political prisoner or leader of a human rights group. This is another unfortunate result. The president couched his remarks on December 17, saying this will bring freedom and democracy to Cuba much more than the confrontation of the last 55 years. That's a great thought, but it has nothing to do with reality. And we've seen it when practically every member of the U.S. Congress that has gone down there to explore trade, and I haven't talked much about trade, and I hope we will, and the potential for trade with Cuba. But every single VIP that has gone to Cuba has gone to stay in military-owned hotels, go to beaches where Cubans are not allowed to go because there is apartheid, tourism apartheid in Cuba. They're given government-run, government-controlled tours, for example, of hospitals to show them what great advances the Cuban health system has achieved, but they're not taken to the hospitals that the Cubans have to go to. The hospitals they're taken to are the ones that the military, the Communist Party members, the hard currency, the people who have hard currency in Cuba, like tourists or others, can go to, but not the people of Cuba. Those hospitals, you have to bring your own sheets, you have to bring your own aspirin, you have to bring buckets to clean the floor around your bed, you have to bring disinfectant, because they don't exist. However, they have plenty of money to host all of these visitors. That, unfortunately, and there's lots of other examples, I'll wind down, that kind of apartheid, the kind of repression that exists in Cuba is what would result from the president's policy if the Congress were to let him get away with it. I hate to use those words, but there have been already, in fact, 4 different bills so far this year to support the president's policy in Congress, all of which have failed, and overwhelmingly, by as much as a 120-vote margin. So either the president changes his approach, or Cuba changes, or I don't see much progress to this resumption of diplomatic relations.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Reich. I told you he was going to be provocative. I think this topic alone deserves an entire workshop. I asked a friend named Alejandro Hope, who worked in Mexican intelligence for like 6 years, and Mexico had a good relationship with Cuba, and I tried to encourage him to work internationally. He's focusing now on homeland security in Mexico. I said, what should we look at? And he said, look, they're going to do exactly the same thing as Putin. Their intelligence services, are superb. They might be listening, hello, if one of you. And they know where the bodies are buried. And they're going to use strategically their alliances with crony capitalists and their knowledge to capture assets, not only in the Caribbean, but all over the region. So again, it's a major challenge. And to address some of the regional challenges and the relevance of Bahamas and the Caribbean and the economic outlook of the Caribbean, we have an outstanding speaker who has a great career in the academy, in government organizations, and now in the private sector, in the think tank community. The acronym of his think tank is in Spanish, reads beautifully. It means, do you believe? You know, you put CREES, means to believe. But in translating to English, it would mean Regional Center for Sustainable Economic Strategies. He's a graduate of the Columbia University and again teaches at the Catholic University in the Dominican Republic. Is a superb economist, and it's a great privilege to have another high-level speaker with us today. Ernesto Selman, I think you're going to use a PowerPoint. Thank you for being with us, Ernesto.
Well, with this introduction as a superb economist, now I don't know what to say. So thank you very much, Alex, and thank you, the Nassau Institute, Templeton Foundation, and Atlas Network for inviting me here. It is a pleasure to be here and with Ambassador Otto Reich. Okay, so I would talk a little bit about the impact of the open up, or the supposed open up of the Cuban economy in the Caribbean, in our region. And so I'm gonna use a couple of slides to see where is Cuba in terms of institutions, economic liberty, and from there I'll try to go on and analyze a little bit the impact of Cuba's economic or supposed economic reforms. Okay, so if we look at the Index of Economic Freedom 2015, we see that Cuba is back in the 177th position. So we know that Cuba is very much, and if we see, for example, other Caribbean nations, we see the Bahamas, Jamaica, Barbados, which is in a relatively good position, but again, Cuba and Haiti and Venezuela are like the most, in terms of the Caribbean, the most backward-looking society in terms of economic freedom. If we see, this is an index that Martin Krause from Argentina does, and he analyzes this in a report every year, and he's looking at institutional quality. And what we see here, again, Cuba being in the back of the line. And so this is one of the main challenges that Cuba will have in the future if we're looking in economics and how it progresses. Again, we see most of some of the Caribbean nations here in a much better position than Spanish-speaking countries in the Caribbean. And of course, you inherited British institutions, and we inherited Spaniard institutions, so there's a big difference there. So, and well, in the Doing Business Index, of course, Cuba is not in the index, but if we see Haiti, and we then should ask ourselves, where is Cuba there? I mean, if we take these, the things that they take into account to develop this index, Cuba would be very, very back in the line. I mean, if you say, what's the time to get electricity in your home or an enterprise? It's crazy. Well, if we talk about bankruptcy laws, well, there's no private property there, so there's no bankruptcy law there. So it's gonna be very bad if we calculate this index in terms of doing business in Cuba. What we've seen, and before we go here, what we've seen, and I think Ambassador talked a little bit about this, is that Cuba right now is in a very dire straight position as Cuba, Venezuela is coming down with an economic and political crisis. Basically, Cuba depends on Venezuelan oil and subsidies. And so Cuba is looking at what is going on in Venezuela right now, and they're thinking, okay, this is not good, this is not gonna be good in the next couple of years, and if we see Cuba's exports are going down as well. So they're saying, okay, we have problems. Houston, we have a problem, as in the US they would say. And so they're looking at, okay, we should do something, and that something is let's do the supposed opening up of the economy to get investments. Now, a lot of people have said that Cuba will implement a Chinese type of model, and I think it's going to be more of the Russian model than the China's model. Again, Cuba is looking at the problems that it will face when the Chavista regime will, I mean, at some point it'll come down in the next months or a couple of years. And they're looking at this and they're saying, okay, we have no alternative sources of income. We have, our exports are coming down. We depend basically on that, on Venezuela, and that's why we need to do something. And I think they will do something. But again, I don't think it'll be the Chinese model. I think it'll be more the Russian model, as Ambassador was saying. I agree 100% there. Okay, one of the main challenges for the Caribbean and our nations are going to be foreign direct investments. Aside from the Dominican Republic and Trinidad and Tobago, foreign direct investments have been coming down in the last few years in the Caribbean nations. And this will represent a challenge for our countries, because Cuba is it's not the new kid on the block, but it's something new. There are lots of opportunities to invest there. And I think it'll be, this foreign direct investment, it'll be business with the government. And I would say it'll be like big projects that will be coming in, and big projects that would be developed in association with the government. It's not going to be free market, people investing there in different businesses. It's going to be big projects, and it's going to be businesses with the government, basically. And I would say the same model that they've been doing with tourism, and Ambassador talked a little bit about this. I think there's a lot of opportunities in the mining sector in Cuba, and I think those are going to be the most appetite. There will be the most appetite for investment will be in that area, and this is new for Cuba. Also, in terms of agriculture, of course, Cuba, the government owns the land, and so there will be some big projects in agriculture. But again, it'll be, I think, it'll be with doing business with government, and I think it's going to be for exports, basically. Most of the things that and the foreign direct investments and the projects that will be developed will be export oriented. In terms of manufactured goods, again, we see there's a challenge for a lot of the Caribbean nations in terms of rum, cigars. For example, in the DR, we're the most important producer of cigars in the world. We'll have some competition there, and rum, for example, I think Maquila's project will get, and that again, I think everything is going to be business with government. And big projects, I don't see any small things going on, and nothing oriented to the local economy, mostly export oriented. There'll be a lot of opportunities for doing business, again, with government in terms of infrastructure, energy, roads, telecom. So all of these things will a lot of investors from the US will have appetite for this, but then when they get to negotiate and do business, it'll be with government, and so we'll have to wait and see how will that develop in the near future. In the end, I think institutions are the main factor that is penalizing the Cuban economy. We said, well, Ambassador talked about political institutions. I'm not going to go into that because it's very obvious. We have a totalitarian regime, and even though they're talking about opening up and everything, there's nothing going on, and we have friends and contacts in Cuba and the dissidents, and so the repression is still there. I mean, there's no movement, let's say, to open up the political institutions. Of course, the rule of law, contracts, private property, there's no advancement in those areas either. Government is still has a stronghold in property. Freedom of association, not only in terms of economics. Thank you. I'm just finishing. Not in terms only of economics, but political association. I mean, when there's more than 4 people meeting in Cuba, there's something going on there, and one of the 4 is a spy. So how can you move along in terms of political institutions there like that? Also, well, when we say profits, are profits good or bad? When we talk about economic reform in Cuba, I don't think the government will let anybody, gain or get money or profits. I think they will still monopolize profits in Cuba. The freedom to invest and to work. Ambassador was talking about how the labor market works when there's foreign investment in Cuba. So I don't see any changes in that. I don't foresee any changes in the near future, at least. I don't see any changes in that. And also free goods markets how's gonna that play in Cuba? I don't see how that will work, and what are the institutions that are needed for all these to work. I don't see how they're gonna move with this with the stronghold and the political institutions that they are keeping. They're not moving from there. So I think institutions matter, and in terms of economics, institutions matter as well. And I think this is the area where our countries in the Caribbean must move forward to basically to confront this new reality in the Caribbean, with Cuba opening up and getting investments and trade with the United States. With that, I will leave it there, Alex, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to both speakers. We started 15 minutes late, so just to recover, we're going to do 10 minutes of Q&A. So if you can just briefly mention who you are if you ask a question. If not, while you think, Mort Taylor.
I have a question for Ambassador Reich. What would you say, and I very much appreciate your presentation, what would you say to the argument that opening or engaging with Cubans who have been isolated for so long, that allowing them to engage and interact with people from the West is in effect a way to undermine the government there? And I think I know what you'll say, but I'm just, you understand the argument. And that is in effect a way to undermine the government, because by the Cuban people, by engaging and interacting and sort of ending their isolation, that is actually a way to undermine the government and to promote freedom and change within the country.
Well, that is one of the arguments, of course, that the president and people who support this opening make. And it is flawed in a number of ways. Number one, the Cuban people are not isolated. There have been tourists there since the end of the Soviet Union. By the way, that tells you something. Until the Soviet subsidies ended, Fidel Castro couldn't care less about having tourists in Cuba. He was forced. That's a very important word in diplomacy. He was forced to open up the tourism sector when the $5 billion a year, or 25% of the GDP at the time, ended. Number two, those millions of tourists that have been in Cuba in the last 30 years have made absolutely no difference. There's no free press, there's no free labor union, there's no freedom of association, there's nothing. So, I'm sorry, I disagree. That is not a valid argument. No country has ever been liberated by tourists. It's been liberated either in the case of a war or when the government collapsed as a result of internal or external pressures. And sanctions have played an important role. You know, one argument that I hear all the time in Washington, not just here, is, well, the Soviet Union fell because of trade and tourism. Wrong. Not only wrong, completely false. Trade and tourism, where the Soviet Union peaked in 1980, the year before Ronald Reagan came in, and he made it even worse. It really imposed sanctions on the old Soviet Union. And in 5 years, they were forced to allow Gorbachev to come in and impose a system of what he called glasnost and perestroika, transparency and reconstruction or reorganization, that ended communism, because communism cannot stand transparency. And it's based on complete control over the people. That's what's happening in Cuba. So those who tell you that the Soviet Union fell because of constructive engagement or trade and commerce are completely wrong. They don't know history. They don't know that in 1980, the Carter administration imposed sanctions, the grain embargo, which, by the way, were opposed by our allies, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, by the very same people who today support President Obama's flawed policy towards Cuba. The people don't learn lessons very well. And then in 81, Ronald Reagan came in and imposed further sanctions because of what was going on in Poland, because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we basically helped to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Cuba is bankrupt, has been bankrupt for quite a while. They've remained afloat economically because of course, the 30 years of Soviet subsidies, then the Venezuelan subsidies. Venezuela has been providing, until recently, to Cuba twice the amount of money that the Soviets provided on a yearly basis. I mean, it's hard to believe, but that's what it amounts to. That was disappearing. So what Obama has done is thrown a lifeline to a dictatorship and saying, here, I trust you enough that you really want to change, and you really want to treat your people well. Those last 55 years, well, they were just, let's just let bygones be bygones. And we're going to let you float your economy, put your own children in power for the next 55 years, and let us hope that some democracy emerges. That's my answer.
Thank you. One there and then over there.
Good morning. My name is Chris Ryan, and my question is, it seems as if it's a cycle.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Oh, sorry. It seems as if, my name's Chris Ryan, it seems as if there's a cycle that's happening in Cuba. The fall of the Soviet Union resulted in, especially when Chavez came into power, cozying up to Venezuela. And Venezuela is providing effectively $1 billion to $2 billion of subsidies to Cuba. Yet at the same time, Venezuela also is one of the largest suppliers of oil to the United States, and in fact owns one of the largest downstream oil refining organizations in the United States through Citgo, which is a direct subsidiary of PDVSA. So I guess my question is, if the United States is so keen to see Cuba either open up or fail, they could bankrupt Cuba in a day by just seizing the assets of Citgo and cutting off that oil from Venezuela. I just don't understand why, we're in a situation here where the only sanctions against Cuba are effectively from the United States. All of the other countries, most countries have diplomatic relations and trade with Cuba.
Exactly. And what have those diplomatic relations and economic relations with Cuba accomplished in terms of freedom, which, by the way, is a word that doesn't appear hardly in this debate.
Well, of course, but they have, Venezuela has subsidized Cuba now since Chavez came into
Right.
power.
By the way, it's closer to 10 billion, I'm sorry, it's now 1 or 2 billion. The Venezuelan subsidies in terms of oil, in terms of what the Venezuelan government pays the Cubans to, for example, run the ports. All the ports and airports in Venezuela are run by Cubans.
So I guess really it comes down to, wouldn't it be more effective if you were to, the drop in oil prices is certainly having its impact upon Venezuela, which is obviously having a consequential impact on Cuba. But wouldn't it be better for the United States to take a look at what's happening in Venezuela and decide what are we going to do with that oil that's coming in?
Well, first of all, the United States today imports half as much oil from Venezuela as it did 15 years ago.
Well, of course, because the U.S. has certainly increased production.
Because what?
The U.S. has increased its production with
No,
shale
but isn't
oil.
just, no, I'm sorry, that began long before fracking. The PDVSA production, the oil company of Venezuela, is so incompetent under the current government, the socialist government that began with Chavez, that the production dropped by 40%.
I understand that. I guess my question is really fundamentally,
Yeah, I think there is. This could continue, for long,
okay.
but I think
We'll take this off.
We all agree.
Yeah.
We all agree
No, but-
with some of the substance.
The point is that they're both important countries, Cuba and the United States. They're both run by anti-American governments that repress their people. I think the objective should be to bring about freedom, not to normalize relations with dictatorial governments. We can do that. That's very easy to do. And in fact, we have been criticized correctly for having normalized relations with right-wing military governments in Latin America and the Caribbean in the first half of the last century, primarily. The second half, we changed our policy. Why should we now normalize relations with left-wing military dictatorships that do not provide for their people? There's hunger in both Venezuela and Cuba. And it's not a result of the U.S. sanctions. It's a result of Marxist policies. It's what made the Venezuelan oil company drop its production by 40% the moment that Chavez came in.
fully agree.
Well, we cannot engage in further,
Thank
but
you.
again, we can stay and debate.
Yes.
We have time for one question. I would like to know if the Dominican Republic, if the government, is beginning to strategize, or what is the position. But then, why don't let him ask the question,
Yes,
and
of
then we answer both, and then. Okay, well, two more, then one, and then this one. Go.
Hi, Anders Mikkelsen. This is for Ambassador Reich. One thing I didn't really understand in the presentation is I didn't really get how the U.S. is actually helping the Cuban regime. And certainly it's a terrible regime, and it's unfortunate that the Cuban people and Venezuelan people are suffering as nature takes its course. But I just didn't see how any of this is really going to help the Cuban regime. Are we going to send them money the way Venezuela does, or?
And then wait, and then let's do the last question, and we do the three in a row.
Yeah. John Rogers, and
Yeah.
I just would like to ask Ambassador Reich, what would he do if he were President Obama? 3 things that he would do.
Sorry, did you get the question?
I'm sorry.
Can you repeat?
Yeah. If you were President Obama,
What would you do if you were president?
tell me 3 things that you would do to try and correct the situation in Cuba.
Okay, let me answer the last one first, because I don't get a chance to be president very often. So, okay, what I would do, frankly, is I wouldn't reinvent the wheel. I would do what has already worked. I had the privilege of working for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. The United States was faced with an existential threat, the Soviet Union, which had said that they were going to bury us. And a lot of people think that was just rhetorical. It was not rhetorical. The year before Ronald Reagan was elected, 1979, it was an important year, by the way, even for the Caribbean. You know, it was the year that Grenada was taken over by an extreme, brutal Marxist government. The year that the Sandinistas won in Nicaragua. The year that the Shah of Iran was overthrown and replaced, an authoritarian ruler and replaced by a totalitarian regime, which is still in power. The year the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was on the move, and the enemies of the United States were on the move. That helped to bring Ronald Reagan into office. Ronald Reagan's policy, and he said it, he said, as far as I'm concerned, our strategy is we win, they lose. We haven't had that very much, frankly, in too many presidents since then. And that's how we won. Reagan did not. People say, another misconception is, you know, why were you afraid to talk to your adversaries? Reagan wasn't. Oh, that's right, Reagan wasn't. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk to our adversaries. But Reagan did not talk to a Soviet prime minister until the 6th year of his 2 terms. People forget that. He did not talk to Chernenko, Brezhnev, Andropov. He finally talked to the 4th Soviet leader that he faced, and that was Gorbachev. And when we had weakened the Soviet Union to the point where Gorbachev had no choice but to negotiate seriously, and Reagan negotiated seriously. We gave, but they had to give. In the case of Cuba, we are not giving anything, and it goes back to the earlier question. How are we helping Cuba? President Obama has unilaterally lifted sanctions on travel, on remittances, now on doing business, you know, financial transactions with Cuba. What has he gotten back in return? If anybody can tell me. I mean, what? We got a hostage back that the Cubans had taken under false pretenses, an aid worker who was in jail for 5 years when he shouldn't have been. Do you think Ronald Reagan would have allowed an American to be in jail in Cuba for 5 years without lifting a finger like Obama did? No. You know, we don't have the respect of our adversaries. The right has lost the respect, and the left has lost the fear of the United States. And that is very bad. I mean, you look around the world today, there is chaos everywhere. And it's because the one country that had protected the peace, frankly, from not only the end of World War II, but even before, is no longer reliable. And the case of Cuba is a very good example of unilateral concessions to adversaries who have their boot on the necks of the people that they're supposed to be ruling. And the United States is helping them to stay in power. That's the result of this opening to Cuba, if you examine it.
Well, thank you so much, Ernesto. A little word about Dominican Republic reaction,
yes,
or
the Dominican Republic will face challenges, I think, more so than other Caribbean nations. We have the rum, cigar, maquilas, and other manufactured goods that I think they will attract some investment and compete more so than what it is today. Again, Cuba has been receiving tourists and from everywhere in the world except for the United States. So Cuba is the second most important recipient of tourists in the Caribbean after the DR. And so I think we'll face some challenges there. I don't know, because if you analyze by segments in the U.S. market, I think it's going to be the adventure segment and political, so I don't know how big that is. I mean, I think a lot of tourists in the U.S., yeah, they look for sand and beaches, but they also look for golf courses. How many golf courses there are in Cuba, for example. So, but I think it'll be a challenge. The Dominican political process right now is politicized in terms of elections. Next year we have presidential, congressional, and local elections. So there's no clear strategy right now on dealing with these challenges. But time will come that we'll have to focus and strategize on how to deal with these challenges.
well, thank you so much to this extraordinary speaker. Some of you know that I follow the Pope and his writings, and in economics, being an Argentine, I fear that there is a chance that this action by the United States, will allow the Vatican to reclassified Cuba as a legitimate third way government, as some of them did in the first 2 years before it was clearly seen as a Soviet satellite. So, and that would give a lot of coverage to whatever Cuba wants to do in the region, the same as happened with Putin around the countries in his neighborhood. Jorge Borlandelli is going to make a little brief announcement, and then we ask the other speakers.
On behalf of the Nassau Institute, I thank the speakers, Ambassador Reich, Mr. Selman, and I want to present you with a token of our appreciation. That's a book of photographs from all Nassau.
Well, and if I ask the speaker and the moderator of the next session to join us here.